Money FM 89.3, the best of the afternoon update. The afternoon update with Lynlee Foo.
Very good Tuesday afternoon to you. How are you doing this Tuesday afternoon? Now, if you run a business in Singapore, chances are your data is stored across borders, maybe in a regional data center, maybe on a global cloud service. For years, most companies didn't think twice about that. As long as the service worked, it was business as usual. But in an increasingly uncertain world where your data lives and who controls it has become a boardroom issue. A new data sovereignty position brief by Pure Storage and the University of Technology Sydney reveals that every single business leader surveyed across 9 countries, including Singapore, is rethinking their data strategy because of sovereignty risks, from service disruptions and regulatory shifts to geopolitical tensions and customer trust. Joining me to unpack what this means for Singapore companies is Nathan Hall, General Manager and Vice President of Pure Storage for Asia Pacific and Japan. Nathan, good to have you with us.
Lynlee, thanks for having me on.
Now, Nathan, a few years ago, data sovereignty was something the legal or IT teams handled in the background. So what's driving this shift to the boardroom?
Well, just first of all, it absolutely is shifting to the boardroom. That survey that you mentioned, which was across C-level executives in Europe, in Asia, across 9 different countries. In technology, it's pretty rare for in any situation for everyone to agree on something, and for 100% of the interviews to come back saying that they were actively rethinking where the data is located, certainly indicates that it's not just an IT issue, it's not a legal issue, it's now on the board's agenda. And it's easy to understand why. The consequence of inaction here isn't just a fine anymore. It's about loss of customer trust, reputational damage. As businesses increasingly have more of their business digital, if you don't know where your data lives, who has control over it, you're losing control of your data means you're also losing control of your business. So this has become a major issue at the board level, not just in Singapore, but pretty much everywhere in Europe and Asia.
And it's happening faster than many might expect too.
Yes, absolutely. It's something that we're hearing just pop up a lot more. I know it's gotten into the top 10 inquiries for one of the top tech analysts, Gartner, over the past year. So it's something that we're seeing a lot more interest, and more than interest, desire for action across companies.
Okay. Now, Singapore sits at the heart of Asia's digital economy. It's a trusted data hub, but it's also incredibly connected to global systems. Nathan, how does that shape the sovereignty conversation here?
Well, what's interesting about data sovereignty and Singapore's place in it, certainly Singapore has a lot of multinational headquartered here, or their Asia branches is headquartered here. And being an island, a lot of where we store our data often can't be on this island from a power, space, cooling issue. But data sovereignty actually goes beyond where the data itself is stored. What we've seen is actually customers, companies could be storing data in a data center in a country and think that data is safe. But if that essentially where they're storing it is owned by another company, a foreign company, it turns out often those foreign laws can still access that local data. So even local data isn't safe if foreign laws can still reach it. So that's something that's going to be, especially in a highly interconnected business that many companies in Singapore drive, that's a really important dimension of the data sovereignty issue. Not just where your data is, but who has jurisdiction over that data.
Okay, so the key is staying proactive.
Absolutely. It's about staying proactive. It's about really learning where your data is, understanding not just where it is, but who has access to it, but also being able to be dynamic, right? The one thing that is continuously happening at faster paces is change with recent geopolitical events, tariff upheaval. Companies need to be able to be agile and be able to not just know where the data is, but move it to deal with different regulations and sometimes even conflicting regulations.
I'm beginning to see why many boards here are treating sovereignty as part of long-term business resilience and not just a compliance afterthought.
Yeah, it is. I mean, more and more businesses have more and more of their business process, their actual business, is in the digital landscape. And we're in this kind of perfect storm of regulation, geopolitics, and significant growth. And so this business has become, as data and digital becomes more of core to businesses, they need to understand what is their strategy, How do they get their arms around these incredibly valuable resources that often are the business? And how can they move quickly as geopolitics change, as the competitive landscape changes?
Forgive my ignorance, but doesn't this mean that companies need to bring everything on shore? But it's not that black and white, I would assume. And how can firms then protect sovereignty without losing access to global innovation?
That's a really important thing, and it's a great question. It's something that companies need to intelligently balance, and they don't have to choose between sovereignty and speed of innovation. They don't have to shut off foreign cloud providers. They can have both fast innovation, access to global markets and technology, and sovereignty, risk reduction. And really the first step is everybody, at least that we surveyed, is thinking about, which is you have to start thinking about it and then really move into a risk assessment that kind of looks at hybrid approaches of both, using sovereign providers and multi-national technology. And then also prepares you for that regulatory evolution so that if you can understand where your data is, who has control over it, create governance and policy around that, and then work with technology providers that can allow you to react rapidly or ideally proactively to changes in the marketplace, that's the place where companies are going to want to be.
Sounds like a layered strategy almost.
It is. It's about really creating a multidimensional strategy that allows you to ensure that your business can keep operating, can keep innovating, no matter really what's happening in the world, making certain that you have access to the markets you need to have access to, making sure that you have access to the data that drives your business. And of course, that's increasingly important in a world where, AI is not just a buzzword, but the reality across so many, of companies' technology decisions and investments. And AI is fundamentally fueled by data.
Okay, it sounds like we're all having to think about resilience and flexibility as well.
That's always been important in the technology landscape, that flexibility, because it's hard to predict the future. And if you have flexibility, you don't have to as much.
Nathan, one of the findings that stood out for me was how 85% of leaders said loss of customer trust is the biggest consequence of inaction. Why is trust so central to this issue? It's
central because companies build relationships with their customers, whether those are consumers or businesses, and you kind of trust is built on maintaining commitments, and that's commitments to not lose data, to not expose data to the sources that clearly customers wouldn't want that exposed to. And this sovereignty issue gets at the heart of that. There's been incidents where a cloud provider in another country has had, because that country has jurisdiction over that data, has actually had, through lawsuit, foreign data moved out of country, out of the control of their customers. And that's, if you commit to not doing that, and then you're forced to do that by by the country you operate within, that's a real challenge. And that's a real break of trust with customers. So it is about reputational risk. And that's something that is at the heart of the sovereignty issue. Which leads to competitiveness as well.
Nathan, different industries must be approaching this in very different ways, I think. What trends are you seeing across sectors?
Well, we're seeing, starting really in Europe, the kind of first waves of sovereignty as a board-level issue came through regulations such as GDPR, kind of preparing companies for certain parts of data, usually like the data that had citizen information on it, for example, that they had to know where that data was and keep it within the borders of those countries. So that kind of got it, because the penalties were so high, including just enormous penalties and the risk to actually being ordered to halt business. That got it up to the board level there. And we're starting to see that now more here in Asia. Certainly as multinational companies have to operate across multiple regulations, but in countries such as Indonesia, which are introducing data sovereignty law, India is also starting to talk about it. So really, it's about this trend that I think started in Europe, but is now happening everywhere and is only being accelerated by these recent geopolitical events where companies need to ensure resiliency across what fuels their business, which is more and more data.
Okay. Do you see that mostly in manufacturing and supply chain industries, or?
We see it across every industry, and we see it very much in banking, for example, financial services, where they are kind of used to high degrees of regulation, and this is kind of onboarding another aspect of that. Healthcare, a lot of types of verticals that have a lot of kind of customer data That's kind of where it hits first. But increasingly, data sovereignty regulation is also about, entire types of technology that can or can't be used anymore. And so that hits basically every type of company that there is. If you are using a service that your business depends upon and it's from one, provider, and now that provider from an export control perspective can't provide you that technology anymore and your data is stuck there, that's a major problem. So that's a problem no matter what type of business you run, from finance to healthcare to manufacturing. It hits everyone the same way.
Okay. Technology is one part of the story, but this shift also depends on people. How ready are boards and leadership teams in Asia to navigate sovereignty conversations meaningfully?
I believe they are starting to get there. Because a lot of this originally surfaced in Europe. I think there's a lot of cross-pollination of understanding strategies from that the EU hit first with GDPR, and seeing how those techniques may apply here in Asia. And as part of a kind of a larger kind of geopolitical business risk assessment that I think is going on across multiple dimensions, where this is part of that. So I think there is a lot of readiness, but the devil is in the details. This is an issue that, the board is probably going to have to roll up their sleeves a little bit more to really deeply understand the problem, how to address it, and ideally how to be proactive and agile enough that it becomes a competitive advantage, where your brand, your resiliency, your ability to quickly adapt is something that puts you ahead of others in the marketplace.
Well, you take care of Asia Pacific and Japan. So how well positioned is Singapore in that respect?
I think Singapore is well positioned because there's a lot of multinational companies here that are used to dealing with multiple layers of regulation across their business operations. We do have a lot of data and services that are hosted within Singapore, but also in neighboring countries. We've had to balance a mix of economic changes, especially over the past year. So Singapore and Singapore companies in general are highly, ready to adapt to change. And this is yet another one coming their way, a big one, a strategic one. But it's, I think most companies I've talked to in Singapore are used to change and are used to staying ahead of it.
Okay. And for leaders listening who might be wondering where to start, what are the first few practical steps they should take?
The first really is an intentional assessment, really, figuring out from a risk perspective, where does your data sit across your critical applications that deliver business operations? And then, what are the possibilities in terms of what can you do, both in terms of the current landscape and if things were to change? So that risk assessment that then kind of moves into evaluating potentially, a greater mix of sovereign service providers and an understanding of how fast can you move if you have to. At least your eyes are going to be wide open as changes occur, as opposed to hoping for the best but not really understanding your current sovereignty state.
Okay, and as AI adoption grows, global regulations will tighten. Where do you see data sovereignty heading over the next few years?
I see it only more and more of it. And I see that companies will need to be prepared often to have the ability to quickly move data only to one location, or on the opposite side of that, ensure that the same data is available in multiple locations so that they have, if you think of data as the supply to your business operations, you want to have supply chain diversity. And so that's where I think we're going to get to kind of data supply chain diversity, so that multinational companies can ensure that as things change, as they change faster than ever, they're ready to quickly adapt, almost in terms of business as usual, right? This regulation came out, suddenly this next month, and it's just another thing that we're adapting to, and we have a policy and a process for how we do that. That's where I think it's going to be. It's going to become business as usual for the most well-run companies.
So do you think sovereignty will become a very important source of competitive differentiation?
Yes, it will, because it'll become competitive differentiation in the IT supplier space. So those vendors like Pure that can make that easy for customers, that will be a competitive advantage for the suppliers. But it'll indirectly also be a competitive advantage for non-IT vendors, because if they can quickly adapt to this and do that with less effort on their part, they can focus more on their core business and innovating without disruption, without having to spend a lot of effort in complying to the new data sovereignty. So definitely, it's a competitive differentiator for IT vendors, but indirectly, it'll also be a big differentiator for all companies.
Nathan, thank you so much for your insights, for joining us to break down why data sovereignty has moved from the server room to the boardroom and why it's fast becoming a strategic imperative for companies. He is Nathan Hall, General Manager and Vice President for Asia Pacific and Japan at Pure Storage.
Thanks, Lynlee.
Money FM 89.3